Hello, I'm Adam Kielich, the principal attorney at the Kielich Law Firm in Bedford, Texas, where I help clients with employment law issues. And today's short video is about salaried employees and overtime pay. We'll talk a little bit first about the laws that apply to overtime pay in Texas, and then we'll talk about how those laws apply to different types of salaried employees and where that leaves people with their overtime pay options. And last, we'll talk about what to do if you are entitled to overtime pay, but your employer is not paying you what you're entitled to. Before getting too much further into this video, I do want to point out that I've had an upgrade in my computer that I use to record these videos, or audio, I guess, really. My last computer decided it maybe wanted to catch on fire, so I figured it was time for an upgrade. So I'm trying to get the sound balanced right on my new computer and try to figure out how Windows 10 is operating with my sound setup. So if the sound is a little off, I apologize. I'm working on it. I'll try to get it better next time. So let's talk about some salaried employees and overtime pay. In Texas, there's two laws that apply to salaried employees and overtime pay. First is the federal law, the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the law that sets minimum wage, overtime provisions. When you go to work and there's that poster hanging up in the break room with your pay rights, that is undoubtedly a Fair Labor Standards Act poster. In Texas, we have a state law called the Texas Payday Law. And the Texas Payday Law is very similar to the Fair Labor Standards Act. Incidentally, it's a lot thinner than the Fair Labor Standard Act because it spends a lot of time saying whatever the Fair Labor Standard Act says, that's what we say too. Some states have their own state wage law that's actually much longer and more involved and provides more rights above what the Fair Labor Standards Act provides. But in Texas, we're just kind of hitting the bare minimum, and whatever floor the federal law sets, that's more or less what the state law is going to provide. And because of that, often in employment cases, it's actually the Fair Labor Standards Act that sets out the claims. It really gives teeth to our ability to go out and do something to help clients with their employment problems, at least when wages are concerned. Now, the Texas Labor Code does provide a few things that the Fair Labor Standards Act does not provide, and these are issues about certain payroll procedures, particularly the timing of paychecks and how quickly you have to be paid after you leave your job. These are kind of weird things that should be in the Fair Labor Standards Act, but for whatever reason they left it out. So the state law does provide some protections that are above what the FLSA provides. But by and large, when it comes to talking about overtime and minimum wage, state law basically says, yeah, whatever the Fair Labor Standards Act says, that's what we do. So because at least for this issue, the two laws operate synonymously, we can just really talk about it as one legal standard that applies to both state and federal law. Were you to bring a claim to court, you would most likely want to bring a claim under the federal law rather than the state law because, again, the federal law gives us more teeth, gives us more opportunity to be able to go out and do something to protect our clients under the law. But for now, let's just talk about what your rights are under the law. And if you're listening along the way and you think, hey, my rights are being violated, we'll talk about what to do afterwards. So under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's basically two kinds of employees. Non-exempt employees covered by the minimum wage and overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and exempt employees that are not covered by those provisions. The difference between exempt and non-exempt employees is particularly important when we talk about salaried employees. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, most employees who are salaried are going to be exempt employees. The Fair Labor Standards Act sets out a number of ways that an employee can be exempt from the minimum wage and overtime provisions. One of those, and by and large the biggest exemption, is the Salaried Exemption, which lays out itself a small number of tests that an employee has to meet in order to be exempt from the minimum wage and overtime provisions. These require that the employees are paid at least once per month, that they're paid a set minimum amount per month for a total annual salary. There's also then 3 different tests, and the employee has to meet at least one of them in order to be salaried and exempt from the minimum wage and overtime provisions. I'm glossing over what is a very important topic here because we really just want to hone in for this video on the overtime provisions, and I'll talk about the specifics of how an employee is properly categorized as a salaried exempt employee. But for now, we really just want to focus on the fact that an employee is either exempt or non-exempt, and recognize that most employees who are exempt because they meet one of the salary tests under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, there is a small group of employees that meet that are non-exempt but are salaried, where they're actually paid on a monthly basis a set dollar amount, but they're still covered by the minimum wage and overtime provisions. This creates sort of a weird rule where the employees they're definitely non-exempt. They are entitled to overtime for hours worked beyond 40 hours in the work week, but they're not entitled to the regular time and a half overtime pay. They're actually only entitled to that half. So if you're paid on a salary, but you're non-exempt, and you normally work enough hours so that when you go to calculate overtime pay, a normal employee might make $10 an hour, so their overtime pay is going to be $15 per hour. In that same situation, if you're salaried and non-exempt, then you just receive that $5 for each hour of overtime pay. And that in and of itself is a tremendously complicated, difficult set of rules for a very small set of employees who actually meet those requirements to be both salaried and non-exempt under the Fair Labor Standards Act. By and large, most employees who are salaried are either properly classified as exempt employees, or they're improperly classified as exempt when they should be hourly employees being paid at least minimum wage and overtime pay. So let's really get into the heart of the issue. What does it mean to be salaried and exempt from these minimum wage and overtime provisions? If you're salaried, you're not paid based upon the time that you work. You are paid based upon the performance of a job. Now, sometimes that gets a little blurry because the regulations that kind of surround the Fair Labor Standards Act kind of give employers a lot of room to be able to have those salaried employees work specific schedules where they are essentially expected to work a set number of hours during the week, even though that's normally the way that an hourly employee would be scheduled. And again, where that line is drawn is a little beyond this video, and something I will certainly talk about in another video about salaried employees. But it just helps to understand that a salaried employee is not paid for hours worked, but is really being paid for applying their skills to perform a job. And that's why they're paid a flat amount. And often salaried employees are given more flexibility with their schedule, coming and going, leaving early, coming in late. But again, that's not always true. So that's the salaried component. The exempt component means that you're exempt from minimum wage, so you don't have to be paid that $7.25 an hour each hour. And it's worth pointing out that if you do meet the salaried exemption test, that you're actually paid hourly in amount of money. That's sort of a monthly minimum wage, if you want to think about it that way. But you're not paid an hour-based minimum wage at $7.25 an hour. You're also exempt from overtime. That means you get no overtime pay unless your employer just pays it out of the goodness of their heart, which is unlikely, or you work under some type of contract where the payment of overtime has been guaranteed through a contractual right. But as far as the Fair Labor Standards Act is concerned, if you're salaried and exempt, you get no overtime. So that means that the employer can schedule you on a regular basis well above 40 hours a week and continue to pay you the exact same salary as if you were working 40 hours or 30 hours or even just 1 hour per week. And of course, when it comes to wage law, this is one of those things where there's the rule, there's the exception, and then there's exceptions to the exceptions, and exceptions to the exceptions to the exceptions. So there can be situations where, for example, you're employed by your employer in two different roles. One is salaried, one is hourly. If you perform that hourly work beyond 40 hours, you've got to be paid overtime against that work. But you could still do salaried work and get no extra compensation for working more than 40 hours a week doing your salaried job. This is, again, a very narrow kind of exception that applies to a small number of employees. For the most part, though, if you're salaried, you're going to be exempt, and you're probably working more than 40 hours a week like a lot of salaried employees do. Unfortunately, you're just not entitled by law to any additional pay for those hours over 40. Maybe that's something that we can convince Congress to change or the Texas legislature to change, but pressure from business is pretty tough, and it's hard to make changes that expands pay for workers. So, although we're not going to talk about the specific tests that make an employee exempt from the overtime provision, it is important to point out that just because you're paid a salary, it does not necessarily mean that you are an exempt employee. And you're not necessarily an exempt employee just because your employer says it. There are particular tests that have to be met, and it's very easy for an employer to either construct your job so that the duties do not meet that test, or maybe you should be a salaried exempt employee, but the way that your employer operates and manages your position, you're actually falling out of that test, and you should be paid on an hourly basis, and you are entitled to overtime. So don't just take your employer's word for it. If it feels like you're being treated like an hourly employee, you're probably not that far off the mark, and it's worth exploring whether you might be misclassified as an employee. If you are misclassified and you really are a non-exempt employee, but you're being paid like an exempt employee, you might be missing out on a substantial sum of wages that you're entitled to by law. If you're working more than 40 hours a week, you are entitled to overtime for each hour of each hour of work beyond 40 hours in each individual work week. In addition to the overtime pay that you're not being paid, you're also entitled to recover liquidated damages that doubles the amount of money that your employer owes you on that overtime pay. And you can also recover interest on that sum. You can have your attorney fees paid by the other side, as well as your court costs and other costs of getting to a judgment. So that amount of money can really become substantial, especially if this has been going on for a long time and you're paid a decent sum. Some of these judgments for unpaid overtime can become fairly substantial. Additionally, of course, having your attorney fees paid by your employer allows employment lawyers often to work on a contingency basis where we can help you recover employment wages that you're owed without asking you to cough up large sums of money to help pay for our work because, hey, we want to get paid for our work just like you do. If you work in a department around several other employees who are paid on the same basis, there may be opportunities to form a class action where we can leverage the force of multiple employees and try to get a better resolution that way. The thing I would stress there is, like I said, if it feels like you're not being treated like a salaried employee, if it feels like you're going to work and being managed like an hourly employee where they're nitpicking over your schedule and watching your hours, you may not be wrong, and the best thing you could do for yourself is to contact an employment attorney in your area and talk to them about what's going on, and let that attorney who has experience dealing with these issues and understands the rules and the exceptions and exceptions to exceptions and apply those to your situation and talk to you about what your rights may be and what opportunities are available to you. So that's really it. As far as salaried employees and overtime pay, again, there will be another video, certainly a much longer one than this, that talks about some of those rules about when employees become exempt, not just because they're salaried employees, but some of the other exemptions that are out there in federal law. And maybe the combination of these two videos will form one complete answer to why it is you're not being paid overtime, or why maybe you're not being paid, but you should be paid that overtime pay. So at any rate, that's where we'll stop for this video. Thanks for listening or watching or whatever as usual. You can also find links in the information below the video that will have links to more information on my website and my blog that may help further answer your questions. So again, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks.